Hey, what's going on, everyone? My name is Jose Ramos Jr. Welcome back to the J Area Podcast, where I revisit some of my favorite movies of all time, discuss how it was developed, and share my own thoughts and opinions on the film's cultural significance. On today's episode, we will be revisiting Halloween, released on October 25th, 1978. A short synopsis for Halloween is, quote, 15 years after murdering his sister on Halloween night 1963, Michael Myers escapes from a mental hospital and returns to the small town of Haddonfield, Illinois, to kill again. Halloween is directed by John Carpenter and stars Donald Pleasence as Dr. Samuel Loomis and Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode in her film debut. Now, for me personally, I was really looking forward to this episode, being that it's the culmination of the last 2 months worth of episodes of the J Area Podcast. I wanted to start off this first seasonal release of the podcast as a more Halloween targeted, being that we covered a bunch of horror movies, slasher movies, and of course, what better movie to end it off on Halloween, the most famous slasher film of all time, being that it also influenced so many franchises coming after it, whether it be Child's Play, Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream. Several of those movies we have covered over the last few weeks. But upon rewatching Halloween, it was clear that it was influenced by movies like Psycho and Black Christmas, and we'll dive more in depth in terms of how those films influenced. But I always really enjoy looking back and watching a movie and seeing the stylistic tones or stylistic choices that the director makes in order to honor the past while also adding their own flair to their own movie. When this film was produced and in production, there was a myth that it was originally going to be called the Babysitter Murders. However, one of the producers would go on to debunk this and state that it was always going to be Halloween and take place on Halloween night. John Carpenter even said of the basic concept that it would be Halloween night, and it has never been the theme in any film. His idea was to do an old haunted house movie, and you can kind of get that sense in watching this movie as it centers around the Myers home and the several takes of Michael just peering out the window at Laurie Strode or any of the other children of the streets. It would take 10 days to write the screenplay, and the idea that you couldn't kill evil was going to be the main premise of the story. Halloween was recognized as the night where all souls were released to wreak havoc on the living, and this would lead to a tale of a tormented child who went on a rampage just one random night. Of course, Carpenter wanted to incorporate his own idea of the haunted house, as I mentioned before, but Carpenter also used his own experiences when he visited a psychiatric institution as a part of a college trip. On this trip, John Carpenter would encounter several patients. In fact, there were some that were the most serious and mentally ill patients, as he would describe them. And among them there was a young boy who possessed this blank schizophrenic stare, as he would describe it. And this young patient would serve as the main idea, the main influence of what Michael Myers would become. In terms of filming, there was a low budget, so wardrobe and props were often made by hand or bought by cheap items, and many actors would actually wear their own clothing. The Michael Myers mask, which has become so synonymous with the character in the franchise and is among one of the more iconic masks in horror history, was actually created through a Captain Kirk mask. It was sold for about $1.98 from a costume store, and what they did is they gave it a bluish-white paint job to give pale features of a face. They also widened the eye holes to kind of give a dark, round, and ominous look to the mask itself. Over the course, the film was completed in 20 days over a 4-week period. So again, a low-budget film done in such a short time. There were low expectations for this film, but you can really get that sense of its homegrown talent and just the low, small scale that they had produced this film. And ultimately, it produced one of the longest-lasting legacies in film history. But of course, its production and filming weren't the only reasons why it became such a long-lasting film. And in fact, the many themes that it explores throughout the course of this film and throughout the course of the franchise as well really help navigate fans through the story that is Michael Myers. Michael Myers, the character, the killer, the person. It's all related to the idea of pure evil. Halloween night, of course, as I mentioned, is recognized as the night where the souls would wreak havoc on those in the living world. And it has transformed into a night where we dress up as people that we are not. However, it is on Halloween night that Michael Myers shows who he really is by placing on the mask and parading around Haddonfield and committing all these murders. It's the one night that a person is able to pretend to be someone that they are not. However, for Michael Myers, it's revealing his true self to the world, and that he is just an evil force of nature without a care in the world. and targeting the innocent lives of the babysitters, for example, Laurie Strode. The idea of Michael Myers being an evil force is introduced through the character of Dr. Sam Loomis, who describes Michael Myers as this malevolent force that is just wreaking havoc on anyone that stands in his way. He's even quoted in the film as saying, quote, "I spent 8 years trying to reach him being Michael Myers, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil." And for me personally, anyone that knows me, they know that I'm a big fan of horror films, but also that of true crime. And it's always interesting to dive into the psyche of the killer or the criminal or whatever the crime they had committed, and seeing what motivated them, what ultimately led them down this path that would make some sense in their mind that it would be okay to commit these crimes. And in the case of Michael Myers, I think a lot of it just happens to be lent to one unlucky night and left up to chance, because when he was a child in 1963, that night he just snaps and he ends up killing his older sister. And it's never explained why. It's always just given the idea that Michael was just a force of evil nature, that just one night he snaps, and it leads him down the path into what we know him as. But for the purpose of this review and the purpose of revisiting Halloween, we'll stick to the Laurie Strode story. And I think ultimately there are 2 different trains of thought when it comes to the Laurie Strode story. There are those who accept the idea that Laurie is the long-lost sister of Michael Myers, and he's trying to finish the job that he had started with when he was a young boy, and that's eliminating, the rest of his family. Now, of course, in the original Halloween, released in 1978, that wasn't the case. In this movie, it's never established that they were siblings. That wouldn't be the case until the sequel, Halloween 2. And that's how I would prefer to look at it. I would prefer to look at it as a standalone. For me personally, I follow that second train of thought. Not that they were siblings, but that Michael Myers finally escapes the mental institution, and he returns home. He goes back to the one place that he was familiar with, to the one place that he grew up. He just wanted to go home. And who's the first person that he encounters when he's home? You see him behind the doors, behind the windows, breathing heavily, and he sees Laurie Strode dropping off the key to the Meyer house, that because her father is in real estate and he's trying to sell the home. He becomes fixated. He becomes obsessed with this young girl who somewhat resembles that of his sister. So for me personally, I choose not to look at it as they were siblings. I choose to look at it as just a matter of one unlucky night. It is one act of random violence versus that of motivation. He becomes fixated. He becomes obsessed with now targeting Laurie as a way to reprimand the lost time that he had spent away from Haddonfield. That, and the idea that on any given night there is a killer on the loose, and Laurie Strode just happens to be the unlucky one, with Michael being fixated on her, being obsessed with her, rather than believing that she's his sister. I find that to be more terrifying. I find that to be more unsettling, whereas he has this sense of motivation. He doesn't have an agenda against Laurie. She just happens to be the first girl that he saw when he returned home. Again, without any rhyme or reason, it's almost as if it was predetermined, as if it was fate. And the concept of fate is, explored shortly in the film. There was a scene where Laurie Strode is in her classroom, and it's probably like a literature class. And she looks out the window, and she sees the car that Michael Myers stole and drove to Haddonfield. And in the background, you can hear her teacher talking about fate and how it's immovable like a mountain. Fate never changes. It's almost as if this film, the events of this film, were destined to happen. And of course, if you were to follow the timeline of the newest trilogy that was released in 2018, in the course of those 40 years that passed by, to see how these events would influence and affect Laurie throughout the course of her life. Sometimes you can't choose your destiny. You have to roll with the punches and deal with what comes with it. And unfortunately, when she woke up that day, she didn't realize that this would be the beginning of the rest of her life, and how she would have to deal with the fact that Michael Myers would be tormenting her for the rest of time. And to just talk about Michael for a moment, Michael In this early film, because we don't dive into the Thorn trilogy just yet, it's just a standalone film on Michael Myers returning home. But he truly does embody the face of evil. As I mentioned, several points in the film, Myers is referred to as the embodiment of evil. Carpenter intended that the audience should not be able to relate to Michael on any level. He wanted him to just be just a killer, a sense of evil, and that's the word that always comes back with Michael. He demonstrates how he's just a force that no one can stop. Again, going back to the release of demonic beings for Halloween, A Night of Perjury. The concept of Michael being isolated for years of his adolescence and now adapting to a society that he knows nothing about. He's basically an uncaged animal on the loose. Maybe I'm looking too deep into it, but again, there's nothing more serious than a series of murders by an individual who does not grasp the concept of reality. Again, a caged animal on the loose wreaking havoc. And then to view it from the flip side of the babysitter, of Laurie Strode. Laurie is one of the early examples of what the babysitter or the final girl, what that trope would become in horror. She's a very studious young girl versus those who participate in promiscuous activity like her friends who are seen to be drinking, smoking, or participating in sexual activity, whereas Laurie is really rested on her laurels and her willingness to achieve better in school or to do right by the kids that she's babysitting. I also find it very interesting to see the evolution of Laurie. Here we see her as a smart, shy, and introverted young woman. And then over the course of this franchise, we see different iterations of how Michael Myers has affected her life. I always go back to the latest iteration of the character, where she's now like this hardened woman who has been through war, very much similar to that of a Sarah Connor after the events of the Terminator, where she was very much, a young woman friendly, and then she turns into this just certified badass after having to fight for her life. And I just find that those plot points are just very instrumental to the character development of Laurie Strode, and that's why she's been identified as probably the prime example of what the final girl should be. Personally, I put her up there with the likes of Sidney Prescott from the Scream franchise and Nancy Thompson from the Nightmare on Elm Street franchises. Those are the three that I think, if you're going to, place a definitive example of what the final girl is and what it could be potentially, those are the three. You can make an argument for like an Ellen Ripley from the Alien franchise, but when I'm talking just strictly slasher, those are the top three in my opinion. And the importance of the final girl really demonstrates a lot just for the character, because eventually she is going to be literally the final person in the act. She's isolated. She loses her friends. She sends the kids off to another house, which is actually a reference to Scream, because she tells Tommy and Lindsay to go over to the Mackenzie's house, and Scream years later would use that same reference. And if you want more on Scream, you can go ahead and check out my episode on Scream that I covered a few weeks back. It's now on YouTube and Spotify. But being that we're talking about Halloween also shows how instrumental parenthood is. For example, the Nightmare on Elm Street films and the Friday the 13th films, they really show how instrumental parenthood is. Those movies demonstrate that the parents are directly responsible for the development of the killer, being that the Nightmare franchise had the parents attack Freddy Krueger, killing him, and now adding a sense of incentive for him to come back for his revenge. Also with Pamela Voorhees, who with her death, again, inspires Jason to carry out this long-lasting legacy of Friday films. But with this film, the idea of absentee parents is introduced. It's a story of teens where you don't really see their parents. We don't really see Laurie Strode's parents for any of the film, with the exception of the first scene. We don't really see the parents of the children like Tommy Doyle and Lindsay. Now with Annie, we do meet her father, the sheriff, but again, not for too much. It's very story-driven through the teen's eyes. But then you ask yourself, well, how does that affect, for example, Michael Myers? We don't know much about Michael Myers' origin story. His parents were gone for the night on Halloween in 1963, the night that he killed his older sister, Judith. Maybe they had a good relationship, maybe they didn't, but it goes back to the idea that it was all predetermined, it was all fate, that this force of evil was regardless going to carry out these actions that he would regardless. What I do love about this movie is just the character development and the depth that they're able to achieve without really doing so in a forced manner. It just kind of happens that way. Another thing that I'm a big fan of Halloween is the use of point of view shots. These shots were used in the movies like Black Christmas, Friday the 13th, and Child's Play. But Halloween kind of really put it on the map about that POV shot, when in fact the only time it's ever used is that opening shot in, again, 1963 when he was a kid. But it's always a perfect example of how to build suspense and anticipation and places you in position of the killer. You're able to see things through their eyes while also saving the reveal for later. Again, and it's not just the POV shots that I'm a big fan of, but there are several shots where it's one long take just following Michael Myers as he stalks Tommy or he stalks Laurie. So although we're not placed in his position, but it's almost as if we're standing right beside him and he's taking these long, slow steps in their direction, or perhaps he's following along the schoolyard behind a fence to get into the car to follow Tommy. And it's just these long takes, not too long where it takes away from the scene, but just long enough to kind of build up that anticipation, almost like a lion out in the field following its prey as it begins to prepare to pounce on that prey. And of course, how could I not mention the connection to Psycho? There are several examples of how John Carpenter pays respect and homage to Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. For example, the character of Dr. Sam Loomis is clearly a reference to the character in Psycho who is also named Sam Loomis. He plays the significant other of Marion Crane, who is played by Janet Leigh. Janet Leigh being the mother of Jamie Lee Curtis in this film. And being that, like, how ironic is it? And I'm not saying anything against Jamie Lee Curtis. I think that she does a wonderful job in this performance and throughout the rest of the franchise. But I feel like it does help to have that relation to Janet Leigh, being that John Carpenter was such a huge fan of Psycho. Again, and it's just a perfect way to carry on that legacy of the Scream Queen. And again, the movie Psycho in itself is also another cautionary tale of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because Marion Crane was, again, visiting the Bates Motel after fleeing with the money from her boss, and just at the wrong place at the wrong time happens to encounter Norman Bates. Now, for more on Psycho, you can go ahead and check out that episode that I have uploaded on YouTube and Spotify as well. Quick little plug to Psycho. Again, being one of the more influential films of all time, certainly in this genre. But if I can stay with Sam Loomis, in Donald Pleasance's portrayal of Sam Loomis in this movie, Halloween, he's an absolute gem. He's very poised, and he stands out in comparison to the rest, being that he's probably the most seasoned actor in comparison to Jamie Lee, who this is her debut film. But you can sense that sense of poise and purpose in everything that he does. All he wants to do is to take down Michael. He thinks it's ridiculous that they were trying to move him, and he tried to tell them that he was a danger to not only himself, but to society. And something about that devotion to his job, that devotion to the people, in a sense, that he needed to make sure that this animal was still tamed. And without going too far into depth about Psycho, because again, that episode is now available on YouTube, but it also deals with mental health. Michael Myers was sent to a mental institution in order to receive the proper care that he needed in order to move on with his life, not unlike that of Norman Bates, who was dealing with, DID, dissociative identity disorder, because of the split personality with Norma Bates. But being that Psycho and Halloween are two of the all-time great films, Halloween leaves a legacy like no other. It's a franchise that is largely responsible for the popularization of the slasher genre, the final girl trope, and the killing off of characters who are involved with sexual activities and drugs. It's a timeless classic that still I rewatch every year for Halloween just for the namesake. And it has left a legacy that includes a total of 13 films, different timelines, that of course include the Rob Zombie remakes, the Thorn trilogy, and the newest trilogy that have been released through Blumhouse. And not only that, but in my opinion, it is the all-time greatest horror theme song of all time. The John Carpenter produced theme song of Halloween is synonymous with the holiday itself. And anytime you hear just a second of that theme song, you immediately think of Michael Myers and this film franchise. I think so highly of this movie because of what it's able to do, not only with its budget, but in the time constraint of the filming and writing and the inexperience of a Jamie Lee Curtis, I think it stands alone as one of the greatest horror films of all time. And I know I've said that with other ones, like Scream, Nightmare on Elm Street, but for me, along with Psycho and Halloween are two of the definitive, most influential movies in the genre itself, just because of what it's able to do for horror and what it's able to do with long-term storytelling as well. And you could even argue with its ability to reboot and reinvent itself years and years later, because the movie itself was released in 1978. We then got a reboot of a trilogy in 2018, 40 years later, still kicking, still going strong. And reports are saying that Halloween might have another reboot in the form of a television show or a film. So Michael Myers certainly isn't going anywhere. He has become a fixture of the holiday Halloween itself. And I look forward to what they'll do with him. But for the sake of this movie, again, if you haven't seen it, do yourself a favor, check out the first one. You won't regret it. Although there are some instances where the acting might not hold up, the story still is timeless. It's a tale as old as time, where it's a random killer attacking a babysitter. It's just a fun movie to put on during the Halloween season. And as we bring this episode to a close, I just wanted to remind you all that I will be uploading new episodes of the podcast every other Monday as an opportunity to improve my personal schedule, as well as going in depth with the YouTube channel. If you guys really enjoy these episodes and have any suggestions for future movies to revisit, be sure to comment which ones you'd be interested in. You can find me at JustJose_3 on TikTok and Instagram, and follow this podcast on YouTube and Spotify at J Area Podcast. But if you're not already subscribed, please do so in order to join in the conversation. If you already are subscribed, thank you for the support, and be sure to share this content so that we can grow this channel as much as possible. And until then, my name is Jose Ramos Jr., and this has been the J Area Podcast.